The bullet punched clean through the photograph held in Elena Varela's trembling hand. Glass spiderwebbed across the face she'd been carrying like a secret. She only had a second to register the hole where her brother's smile had been before the door behind her kicked in and men with Silvestri tattoos filled the narrow gallery corridor. Their boots eating the distance between yesterday and the place where she might die for walking back into a life she had swore never to touch again. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Don Marco Silvestri stood in the doorway like a silhouette carved from winter. Tall, silk suit, the fine scar along his jaw catching the gallery lights. He did not raise his voice. His presence itself was a verdict. Elena felt it the same way she felt the gunshot, an irreversible impact. For a moment, she could only hear the blood in her ears and the small click of the safety on the pistol she had kept under the counter out of habit, not expectation. "You should not have come back, Elena," Marco said, and the room folded around the syllables of her old name, used in public, rarely in private. It was the name that had once opened doors and sealed fates. It sounded uncanny in the place she had been trying to make her life. Municipal gallery, donations box, artists who sketched the city as if it still belonged to everyone. Behind Marco, the men moved with the economy of trained predators. Elena tried to catalog them. An old lieutenant she had seen at funerals years ago, a young man with a jagged earring whose smile was all teeth. But it was Marco she watched. He looked tired in a way his public face never allowed. There was a clock behind his eyes that ticked in numbers only he could hear. Rumor had turned that clock into a contract, a poisoned page dealing his days away like currency. She had never believed in superstition until a courier had handed him a sealed envelope last spring, and then the landscape of his decisions grew colder, more desperate. "I need something from you," he said. The words were simple. The demand that followed was not. "Marry me, Elena. Give me an heir, and you'll get everything." The offer landed like a challenge and like a chain. Elena's pulse knocked against her ribs with a memory of a different life, of a father with a silver hairline and a hand that used to steady her when she was small, of whispers around a mahogany table that decided who would live and who would suffer. Her father had been a consigliere, trusted, feared, until the day the walls closed in. After that, exile had been a long, careful braid of anonymity, of choosing paint over power. Marco's proposal was not a rescue so much as a recalibration of ownership. She could be shielded, but at what cost to the soul that had learned to breathe outside his air? "You will not force me," she heard herself say, and surprise at the sound, steady, thinner than the voice she had in the gallery, flickered through her like a draft. She thought she had left fear behind with the city skyline she now curated, but it had followed, bundled with names and deaths. Marco smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I am not forcing you. I am offering stability, legitimacy, a future that outlives me. They will not come for a house full of heirs." The men exchanged glances. The room smelled of varnish and old paper and the metallic undercurrent of strategy. Elena set the photograph on the counter and smoothed the fragmented glass with a hand that refused to tremble. Her brother's face stared back, ragged but whole under the spidering break, and she felt something tighten, a guilt so hot it left a taste at the back of her throat. He had been the one she couldn't save, the one who had paid for her father's mistakes with his life. The past had not been a place she could visit. It had been a wound she hid beneath folded canvases. "If I say yes," she said slowly, measuring each word like a currency unique to both of them. It will be on my terms. Marco's expression sharpened. He liked to think he was the one who negotiated fate, who issued ultimatums that bent the world. Elena's calm irritated him. You don't get to set terms with me. Maybe I do. Her voice gained momentum. You think you are bargaining for lineage and legitimacy, but you forget what I know and what I can do. I will marry you, but only if I am not erased. I will keep my name, my gallery, my life outside your walls. I will have access to your accounts, a role in the family as more than a trophy. I will decide who is protected under my watch and who is not. I will have the final say on any child that comes into this life. You want an heir, fine, but you will not own me. A small, almost surprised sound escaped Marco. He had spent an entire life reducing people to units that served his ends: soldiers, lovers, alliances. Elena's insistence on conditions, terms that preserved a flicker of autonomy, felt to him like a violation of a rule he had never known he followed. The rule that everything he desired could be bought with silence and fear. He liked bargaining. He disliked being bargained with. You would be a danger to me, he said finally, to the family. And you would be a danger to me, she returned, to everything I fight for. But sitting in exile solved nothing. Maybe this is the only way to keep people safe. Maybe joining you is a chance to change things from the inside. Maybe it's the only thing that will stop more friends from dying. The lieutenant with the jagged earring shifted. Don, her father. Elena cut him off with a look that folded the room closed. My father is dead. His sins were his own. I will not be judged by him. The word Don and the title Silvestri hung between them like a noose and a promise. Marco's life had been built from the bones of alliances, and now paranoia had become an architectural plan. He had seen his lieutenants whisper behind silk ties, had felt the slow creep of suspicion when a courier went quiet. He had been marked. The rumor of the contract was not gossip, but a shadow he could not cast off. There were faces on his desk that belonged to rival families, signatures that could be traced to the capo 2 rivers over. If his time was limited, lineage could make it infinite. Protect me, Elena said, and it was a thing that did not sound like the negotiation she had been rehearsing. It sounded like a child who had once leaned into a father's chest and needed to be soothed. Protect the people left to me. Let me keep the gallery as a sanctuary. Let me continue my work with the prosecutor. Marco's fingers tightened against the brass doorknob. You work with the prosecutor? Elena did not flinch. She had been careful to the point of obsession. She had given documents, threaded whispers through the mouths of informants, always pretending to be small and harmless. She had told herself it was justice, that if she helped bring down what her father had been part of, maybe his name would not haunt every step of her life. Yes, there it was, the knife at their necks, bright and expectant. For the first time since he had stepped into her world, Marco looked genuinely, dangerously moved. Betrayal was one kind of wound, surprise was another. He had never counted on the woman he wanted to place beside him to be the very instrument of his undoing. You will be watched, he said. You will be given the resources you ask for. But you will not be allowed to sabotage the family. And you will not be allowed to make me invisible, Elena said. I will be your wife on paper and in public, but I will not be your possession. They both knew the asymmetry of that promise. Marco could order a life with a nod. Elena had learned to erect boundaries with silence. But there was another currency in play now, a shared fear that made them pragmatic. If the contract truly marked his days, perhaps neither of them had much time to indulge absolute principles. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had shifted under its skin. Buses hissed, vendors hawked, a child laughed at something small. Inside the gallery, time had condensed into two choices wrapped in steel: submission for safety or defiance for principle and probable death. Elena folded the photograph and slid it back into the envelope. Her brother's face looked smaller there, contained, like something she could protect if she made the right bargains. "One more thing," she added, and despite the tremor in her hands, the words were decisive. "If I say yes, you remove the men who threaten innocent families. You clean the lists. You let people go who were swept up in old contracts. You give me names." Marco regarded her like an equation he was trying to solve with a partial set of numbers. "You ask a lot." "So do you," she said. "You need a lineage. I need a way to stop more names ending up in envelopes. We both need each other. We both lose if we are enemies." Silence pooled between them, thick and something like possibility. The lieutenant left to fetch a car. Marco watched him go with a brief, unreadable expression. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have power at her fingertips. Not the power to command violence, but the power to close a file, to free a neighbor, to erase a mark on a child's record. It was intoxicating. "Fine," Marco said at last, and his voice contained the weight of contracts and the rustle of trouble. "Well, Mary, but understand this. I will not be played at my own table. I will not be made weak by any arrangement." "And understand," Elena answered, standing straighter, the curator with paint under her nails and a map of broken lives behind her sternum, "I will not be hidden. I will not be made a symbol for your longevity if it means I lose the right to make hard choices." They both knew what marriage would look like in his world: an ostentation of power, a ceremony that would line the pockets of allies, an heir who could claim territories and treaties. Neither of them knew what marriage could be between two people who walked into it armed with secrets and bargains, or how love, if it dared to lay its head on this new bed, would find purchase in soil tainted by blood. As the men filed out and the city returned to its business, Elena folded the contract of possibility into her palms and felt the weight of a decision that would alter more than two lives. She told herself she was making a strategic move. She told herself it was the only way to keep the people she loved safe. Marco, who had been taught to count every outcome, already began to calculate how to keep what he had, from extinguishing a family line, an empire, a name that would not be a whisper in someone else's mouth. In the quiet that remained, beneath the clatter of closing shutters and the faint echo of footsteps, two damaged people shook hands over a future that neither of them trusted, but both of them feared to lose. The first weeks after the agreement slid between them like a slow, dangerous tide. They married under a watchful sun in a church that smelled of wax and old vows, the kind of ceremony the city commented on at lunchtime, photographed beneath marble and gold. Marco stood at the altar like an immovable promise, his hands folded, jaw tight. Elena walked down the aisle in a dress that belonged to an image she had once despised, soft fabric for a woman who had sworn never to be soft again. Her smile was an economy of motion. Her eyes catalogued every face in the pews. Capos who nodded as if rehearsing their lines. Councilmen who had traded votes for protection. A prosecutor whose hand was clenched in the lap of a sister who meant no words. It felt like selling the gallery to buy time. After, in the house that had swallowed men and secrets for decades, the veneer of celebration cracked into something more brittle. Marco's people brought gifts that were not gifts, pledges wrapped in leather and steel, alliances recorded in the quiet between toasts. Elena watched as men offered bottles, offered territories, offered their own children in barter. Each smile around her became a ledger entry she could not refuse to read. She had asked for transparency, for names, and for the cleaning of lists. But this place ran on debts paid in silence. Requests like hers were unusual. They were a risk to the machinery that fed the family. "You're asking me to dismantle parts of an engine that keeps us alive," Marco said to her once, when the first week of their domestic life had settled into something resembling routine. They were in his study, the ceiling high and the books old. The city hummed outside like an animal pacing in a cage. Marco poured whiskey for both of them, though he had rarely touched it in front of these walls. "You want to free people who owe us loyalty. You want to be the arbiter of who lives and who is released." "I want to stop pain," she replied. "I want to make sure no more children grow up with a name that tells men where to find them. I want to make sure my brother didn't die for nothing." Her hand rested on the folded photograph in her pocket like a talisman. The contrast between the domestic scene and the soft echo of grief sharpened everything. The laugh of a guard passing in the corridor, the clink of ice in the glass, Marco's thumb tracing the scar along his jaw. He had always been a man of strategy. Now, with a clock he did not own ticking in the back of his throat, his strategies turned messy. He wanted heirs. He wanted control. He also wanted to buy time with a woman who refused to be silenced. "You think you know what justice is," he said. "You think you can wade into the world of give and take and simply adjust the balance." "I think I can choose fewer names for your lists," she answered. "I think I don't want to feel complicit anymore." They began to negotiate power the only way they knew, through small battles. Elena insisted on attending some council meetings, an outrageous breach of custom that made the old men mutter and the young lieutenants glance sideways. She sat at a side table, an observer with more leverage than they liked. She learned to recognize the difference between men who feared Marco and men who also feared the future him with heirs. Some of them looked at her like a threat to be neutralized gently. Others watched like vultures learning the scent of an exposed tendon. At night, when the house exhaled, Marco came to her with questions that looked like vulnerabilities. He asked about the prosecutor in private, about the thin woman who had lent Elena her ear at municipal meetings. He watched the way Elena answered, searching for lies and finding only edges that she had dyed to hide scars. Once, when a rainstorm rattled the shutters, he admitted, awkward, almost childlike, that he did not like the thought of being remembered as the man who let his family go to war without a plan for tomorrow. "I don't know the shape of being somebody's husband," he confessed, the sentence small and enormous together. "I have known how to be feared. I have known how to be obeyed. I don't know how to let someone see me as something else." Her chest tightened at the admission. She had come with conditions to protect herself. She had not expected to find a man scared of being replaced by a ledger entry. There were nights when she stroked his knuckles while he stared at the ceiling and talked about his childhood home, about a mother who soothed him with bread, and a father whose hands were steady as a hammer. He would lapse into stories he shared with soldiers, not lovers, how territory had been negotiated across breakfast tables, how mistakes had been buried beneath quiet roads. Those moments were small miracles. She began to collect them like coins she could spend when fear threatened to bankrupt her. But fear breeds allies and enemies in a city like theirs. The more Elena integrated, the clearer lines redrew themselves. A lieutenant named Severio, ambitious and beautiful in the way men with appetites are beautiful, began to observe her with the kind of closeness that was never only curiosity. He hovered in council meetings, offering counsel that sounded suspiciously like threats disguised as advice. A mother's fury, he told Marco once, is different when lineage is at stake. People do strange things to preserve names. Elena felt his eyes the way a wind stings skin. She had built a life out of shadows. Intimacy had a way of opening wounds. Severio's interest in her made her think of being a chess piece. She tried to sidestep him gracefully, smiles at functions, averted glances in hallways, but his persistence pulsed like a bruise. She could see the calculus in his mouth. He saw her as a stepping stone to claim the heir for himself, or to mark Marco's weakness publicly. Marco, who lived for the map of influence, noticed Severio's attention and, in a private hum of control, moved the man into a role that put him closer to the family and farther from Elena's trust. "Keep him near," Marco said at dinner, voice low. It felt like a command and a warning all wrapped together. "Why?" Elena asked. It was the only time she let something like impatience slip. "So he can breathe over my shoulder?" "So I can keep watch," Marco said. "You asked for a seat at the table. Having him by my side puts him where I can see him." It was protection, the kind that kept breath on your skin. But protection in his world often came with chains disguised as safety. Elena was learning the slow geography of how favors were owed and how gratitude could become a ledger entry used against you. She knew what being kept meant. She had escaped that before. She had believed herself free because she could make art, because she could hold a child's hand at an exhibit and not worry the next day would take it away. Now she found that even freedom came with a price in the rooms where men flattened lives into ledgers. Then there were the nights when the prosecutor came to dinner under the pretense of civic conversation, and Elena watched him sip wine and talk about the law like it was a theology of redemption. He asked her about the gallery, about programs for at-risk youth, about the exhibition where a homeless artist had been paid in meals. Elena answered carefully. She had to. Each question felt like a test of fidelity. She was walking a wire strung between two worlds, and each step required a balance that made her feet dizzy. "You're playing both sides," one of the capos said bluntly during a meeting. It was meant to be a threat disguised as observation. "I am protecting people," she replied. "If I can bind you to a future where your children don't inherit this violence, isn't that worthwhile?" Someone snorted. Children also have a way of remembering who built the cradle. It was true. Blood remembers the hands that fed it. A child's future will be marked by the history of its name. Elena found herself thinking about heirs, the tiny, absurd possibility of small hands, of a laugh that would be hers and his. Sometimes she imagined a boy running through the gallery, the echo of tiny shoes on tile, the way Marco's face could soften when he saw something that belonged to him in the world. Other times, she pictured the child as a target, a living ledger with rivals circling like wolves. The fantasies and fears braided into an unbearable rope that she held in two hands. The first fracture came not from outside, but from the brittle inside. A bad decision made on a drunk night in a way that revealed trust where it was most dangerous. Elena had demanded the list of names Marco had promised to examine, the list of those whose lives were being held as collateral. He had handed it to her with the caveat that she would not give it to the prosecutor without his say. She had put it in a drawer, but she also had copied the names. She had been human after all, unable to give the past, so often deadly, to a man who had not confessed his own crimes. She wanted a promise, a reckoning beyond the ledger. One rainy afternoon, while Marco was away on business and the house slept under a hush, Elena passed a sealed envelope to the prosecutor. It was a risk she took with a face that had known loss. She justified it with the memory of children sleeping on rooftops. She justified it with the scream that had been her brother's last word. She told herself it was a surgical strike for a wounded system. It was also, she knew in the quiet afterward, an act of betrayal. She had traded a lie for a hope. She did not yet see the ripples. She believed she was holding a scalpel, but in this house, every blade cuts something you love. When Marco returned and found the list incomplete, the world tilted. He did not rage in the way she expected. Instead, his disappointment settled like dust. "You made promises," he said, voice shallow. "You promised to be part of this family." "I made promises to people," she answered, "people who had names on the list." "To bring me an enemy?" he asked quietly. "To make me vulnerable?" The words were not accusations so much as a ledger closing on one of his own reckoned accounts. "To free people," she said, almost pleading, "to stop cycles of damage." He looked at her for a long time in the study, the city pressing at the windows. And then he did the most dangerous thing he'd done since the agreement. He showed the breadth of his fear. "If you betray me," he said, "you betray what keeps people alive. You tell them we can be struck, and then everyone who depends on us for shelter will look elsewhere." It hurt her as much as anger could have. The moral architecture that had sustained her identity crashed into his arithmetic for survival. They were both negotiating absolutes. Neither could fully see the other's landscape. Elena's betrayal was not a singular crime. It was a mirror. Marco, who had built a world by folding other people's lives into his safety net, now had to reckon with the fact that being loved had a different currency: trust. That night, they slept at opposite ends of a bed that had hosted countless alliances and many secrets. Elena dreamed of her brother's face in the spider-webbed photograph. Marco dreamed of a child whose cradle he could not afford to leave unguarded. When morning came, the household hummed with suspicion. Men who had been neutral now tilted like weather vanes. Saverio's look sharpened into something predatory and pleased. Others closed ranks in ways Elena could feel like a bruise on her ribs. The emotional push and pull tightened into a new, more dangerous rhythm. Each attempt at intimacy felt like a negotiation. Each demand for autonomy felt like a treasonous move. Elena wanted to save people. Marco wanted lineage and certainty. In the middle of their houses and vows, an impossible question uncoiled. Could two people who had been forged by violence learn to make a new covenant without the city consuming it? They would soon find out how costly answers could be. The first bomb was a whisper slipped into the wrong ear. It arrived as a rumor on the lips of a man who wanted to prove himself, Saverio, whose ambition smelled of new money and old grudges. He had watched Elena like a hawk learning the map of a field. He had watched her take chairs at meetings, watched Marco's face when she petitioned for names, and watched how his jaw softened sometimes when she spoke of children. He had learned a lesson every lieutenant knows. The quickest way to rise is to make an enemy look like a liability. "She's leaking to the prosecutor," Saverio told a cousin of a cousin in a bar where deals were made with cigarette smoke and the small clink of ice in a glass. "She passes lists. She wants to weaken us." The cousin did what cousins do. He repeated a good rumor to someone else's nephew, and the story slid like oil through the house until it reached the ears of men who kept sharper knives. By the time the truth reached Marco, it had grown teeth. It was no longer a rumor, but a dossier. Dates, times, the trace of Elena's handwriting on envelopes, the scrap of a gallery receipt paired to a meeting with a prosecutor. It was not perfect, but it was plenty. Marco read it in the study at midnight, the document laid on his desk like a foreign map. He watched the letters as if the ink could rearrange itself into a lie that would soothe him. When he looked up, the house around him felt like a body he no longer recognized, every corridor a vein where rumors ran hot. That same night, he called Saverio to his side in a room where men learned to be small and useful. Who else knows? Marco asked, not raising his voice, but making his question heavy enough to be felt. Saverio, careful and calculating, kept his head angled like a man measuring light for profit. A few, he said. Some of the capos suspected. We grabbed a courier last week who said he'd seen her. He named names with a casual cruelty. They're careful. We can cut them off. Marco's face was a slate. He did not ask why. His life had taught him to accept treachery as currency. What he asked himself instead was how much of the house would collapse if one of its windows were broken. Meanwhile, Elena moved through the gilded rooms with a dread that tasted like iron. She had not lied about her work to her husband, and for that she had believed she would be spared the sort of retaliation other women in their world endured. She had miscounted the ways secrets can be weaponized. When a young courier, nervous, mouthful of apologies, was presented to her in the gallery one afternoon with a folded note and a face full of guilt, the ink on the paper read like sulfur. "We know what you did," it said. "We will not tell him yet. For now, go home and do not come back alone." It was a thin thing to hold, but in their world, thin things cut deeply. Elena felt the room tilt. The gallery, once a safe space of paint and people, became a set of mirrors reflecting her choices in fragments. The photograph of her brother with the spider-webbed glass rested on the counter like a prophecy she could no longer postpone. She called Marco. His answer was clipped, his questions were clinical. "Did you give the list?" "I gave some names," she said, voice small and steady feeling. "People who have been trapped for years." "You gave them to the prosecutor?" he repeated, the words blunt, the accusation a blade. "You put us at risk." "I put people at risk of being killed by our enemies if we keep them," she shot back. "People who never asked for this life. Have you ever thought about what it does to someone to carry a name that invites bullets?" He was quiet, and for a moment she thought he might argue. Instead, he said, "You broke our truce." It was a political phrase dressed as hurt. In Marcos' world, truce was a currency more valuable than gold, keeping your people breathing and your enemies satiated at the margins. Elena's choices threatened that balance. They had both promised a new kind of bargain, the legitimacy of marriage in exchange for a softer running of a harder machine. She had believed she could steer. He had believed he could let her touch the wheel without losing control. Now the wheel rattled. The blow came fast. 2 days later, at twilight, when the house filled with the brittle light of evening and the staff drifted like sleepwalkers through corridors, a car pulled up to the gallery. It was an old model with plates that belonged to men who took care to show effortlessness in brutality. They stayed in the van until Elena stepped outside to take a cigarette, because habit had a way of sealing one's fate. They waited until she unguarded herself. The gunshot that took the courier had rolled through the night earlier like thunder, anonymous, satisfying in a way that silenced mouths. This one was aimed for Elena. She felt the impact like a prayer she had meant to pray for. Pain was immediate and final, a searing white bloom beneath her ribs, heat and iron, and something telling her that the world she had wanted to remake would not forgive easy reformers. She fell, and the pavement took the weight of a life that had not learned to be fragile. The men in the van vanished like smoke. The city chewed on the edge of the event and spat it into gossip. When Marco found her, and he always found what mattered to him, his hands were a map of panic. He carried her to the house with that animal ferocity that had kept men alive when the world wanted them dead. He ordered medics. He called men who kept favors in their back pockets like spare bullets. He tore through the hospital with a patience seasoned by menace and prayer. In those hours, Elena saw him without the armor that had made him a silhouette to the world. He begged, fumbling with procedures and names like a man trying to translate a language he had always refused to learn. He kept speaking to her between the sterile beeping of machines, promises looped in panic. "Tell me what you did," he demanded once, as she drifted between sleep and the bright world of morphine. "I gave names to keep people from being collateral," she murmured. "I thought—" "Thought?" he cut in, the word a blade. "You thought. We don't survive on thoughts, Elena. Not here." She watched him then, saw the desperation as a thing that could look like love or like possession. She had bargained for protection and a seat at the table. She had not bargained for the way safety might be paid with the currency of her body and movement. Lying in a hospital bed with bandages over her ribs, she heard the murmured strategies of henchmen outside the room. Who would be interrogated? Who would be burned as an example? The house reorganized itself to protect Marco, and in doing so, it proved that the most ferocious of alliances can be selfish. The hit failed in the sense that Elena survived. It altered them in more insidious ways. Marco's ferocity became a locked-down version of love. More surveillance, fewer liberties. He wrapped Elena in a custody disguised as care. He demanded her phone, her meetings, the names of the prosecutor's aides she had met for coffee. "If you betray me again," he said, voice low and older than his years, "I will do what I must." The prosecutor pressed charges against anonymous operatives within Silvestri's orbit, but the net that should have caught them felt ragged and partisan. Elena stood in courtrooms and watched men who had smiled at her at weddings now point like wolves. The prosecutor's gratitude was a pale thing. He could not admit that the woman perched at the heart of the case was the same woman who had married the Don. The city loved a spectacle, but feared nuance. Marco's own fractures had begun to spill into dangerous categories. He had never fully confessed the story of the old love, Julia, the woman whose name he kept in the lining of his coat like a talisman, whose death had been an accident he had orchestrated and never owned aloud. The truth about Julia had been a secret that gnawed at him, how her life had tangled with his father's decisions, how Marco's hands had been aimed at the wrong emissary on a night fogged with wine and misdirection. He had never told Elena because confession meant punishment. It meant being vulnerable in a world that made vulnerability a liability. But secrets have a way of leaking through the cracks of new alliances. Elena learned of Julia's face from a cooked-up story shown on a screen, an intercepted message between two rival capos mocking Marco with a photograph of the woman he had loved, the edges of it annotated with accusations. The message accused him of causing a chain reaction that had led to more deaths, including perhaps her brother's, though it was only hinted. Something in Elena's chest that had been ironclad surrendered to the need to know. She cornered him one night in the private study, where books smelled of leather and dust and a man's attempt at culture. The lamplight made his features sharp. "Julia," she said, and the way the name left her mouth was both an accusation and a plea. "Tell me about her." He did not look at her at first. He poured whiskey and let the liquid catch the light. For a man who had been all control, his voice when it came was an animal, and he could not hide it. "She loved people like you did," he said. "She thought names could be washed clean by art. She paid with her life for being soft." "Did you kill her?" Elena asked. The words were a last-ditch hope for simplification. The truth was uglier in either direction. He exhaled. "Not directly," he admitted. "I ordered a thing meant to scare away trouble. It became a bullet that found a different heart. I signed a sort of forgiveness with my denial. I carried it like armor." "Did her death touch my brother?" Elena demanded. Her throat felt raw. The photograph of her brother, his smile split with glass, came to her like a memory that needed naming. Marco's eyes avoided hers, as if looking would rewrite the past. "I can't say," he said finally. There were too many hands in the night, but there were debts and mistakes, and a dozen people who stepped poorly and paid with their lungs. The possibility that Marco's world had somehow been tangled with her private loss crumpled Elena like paper. She had married him to save lives, to unfold a map of mercy in a system designed not to be merciful. Now, every thread of that map seemed likely to entangle something she had tried to bury. They began to break in ways that could not be mended by apologies. Trust, once cracked in their house, fell into a chasm where both of them were dangling by different ropes. Marcos tightened security with the logic of a man who had lost someone to bullet and betrayal. Elena tightened her ethics with the stubbornness of someone who had watched a brother die and refused to let names remain instruments of fear. Their home filled with contradictions, shared dinners that tasted of ash, half-truths spoken with the intimacy of a kiss. The worst fracture, however, was not the battles over names or the whispers of past loves. It was the reveal that Elena had feared most. Severio, whose ambition had started the rumor like an arrow, had not been satisfied with merely sowing distrust. He wanted Elena exposed publicly to mark him as a man who brought clarity to the Don's world. He wanted to remove a potential rival to inheritance by proving the Don's house could not be softened. One afternoon, as the house slept under a lethargic sun, a live broadcast clipped across television screens in the city. A leaked video of Elena handing envelopes to a prosecutor in a dim cafe, her face clear, her hands trembling as if guilt and prayer had braided. The footage was merciless. It framed her in the eyes of the public as a traitor to the Silvestri family and to the city. The press ate it up like a sweet thing. Marco watched the broadcast with blood on his hands from another night's work and a new kind of fury settling in his bones. He had always known that public humiliation was a tool as effective as any knife, but he had not wanted to wield it against the woman who now carried his name. Severio's face on the screen later, smiling like a man who had killed a chess piece and forgotten the queen remained, was the final cut. Elena felt the city close its shutters against her. Friends who had been neutral now sent carefully empathetic messages that smelled like betrayal. The prosecutor distanced himself in press conferences, calling the leak an unfortunate miscommunication and refusing to admit any relationship that could be construed as a conspiracy. Elena was left with the weight of evidence and the loneliness of having been shown as someone who had lied. "I will not be paraded," Marco told Severio when he found the lieutenant in a corridor with that same lazy smile. "You thought you were making a name for yourself. You made one for me. I will decide what happens to those who would threaten the family." Saverio's smile was gone now, and he understood that men in Marco's orbit paid with their lives for their choices. But the damage to Elena was not undone by threats. In public, she was a traitor. In private, she felt the chill of being single-handedly responsible for fractures that could splinter more than two people. They broke apart in the only way they could, in a world that preserved its own hierarchy, through aloneness. Elena retreated to the gallery, bandages under her dress, the photograph of her brother clutched to her chest like evidence of a life not fully lost. Marco retreated to plans and lists and the map of men who owed him loyalty. They spoke in efficient phrases about children and ceremonies and futures that might never exist. Between them, the house hummed like a wounded animal. Men took sides. Some guarded Elena with secret tenderness. Others hoarded her missteps like trophies. The prosecutor, whose idealism was now compromised by the leak, increased the tempo of his cases, bringing down small parts of the network while avoiding the center. The city's appetite for spectacle meant the story would not end soon. And in the dark, two people who had bargained for survival discovered that bargains on the edge of love could be just as lethal as bullets. Elena's betrayal had been moral and urgent and naive. Marco's reaction had been protective and cold and inevitable. Their fractures were now public, and the ripples would not stop at them. They would crash into the streets, into the sons of soldiers who wanted power, into the prosecutor's career, into the very idea of a family with a name that could one day be an orphaned symbol. When the house slept, Marco stood by the window and watched the city breathe, lights blinking like small promises that might be false. He had built a life on being in control. He had built walls around his heart that were meant to keep betrayal out. Elena's leak had found its way through those walls, and now he questioned not just the fidelity of those who served him, but the shape of his desires. He had wanted an heir to make his name survive him. He had not anticipated wanting to be seen as the kind of man someone might choose to stay with, flaws and history and all. Elena, in the gallery, sat under the dim light and traced the spider-webbed lines in the photograph. Each crack seemed to map a life she had touched. She had tried to make art out of survival, to turn trauma into a sanctuary for others. The sanctuary was now a battlefield. She thought of the message pinned in her mind. "We know what you did." She had given names to stop more killings. Instead, she had ignited a series of blows that might make even more names necessary. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had been altered. Inside, their marriage settled into a new, brittle pattern, a public alliance with private fissures that threatened to split wide. And somewhere in the house, Saverio began to make his own moves, imagining a future where his name would be carved into the family history. It was a dangerous fantasy in a world where fantasies came true with the smell of iron. The fracture had widened enough that either one of them could fall in, and the people around them, men with knives, women with law, children with names that were both burdens and hope, waited to see who would leap first and who would be pushed. Marco found Saverio at dawn, the corridor outside the family chapel narrow and wound with the thin light of winter. The lieutenant waited as if for ordination, as if the world owed him a crown. He smirked when the Don's footsteps stopped. He believed he had cleaved more than a reputation. He believed he had pried an old man's empire into his hands. "When you turned me in, you made a choice," Saverio said, voice slick. "You chose the future over the past." Marco's hand rested on the banister, knuckles white. For a long breath, he did not speak. The house was waking. A kettle hissed somewhere. A woman laughed down the hall. It smelled of domesticity and danger together. "You wanted a throne," Marco said finally. "You wanted to make sure I could be cut down and replaced." "I wanted to be important," Saverio admitted, unrepentant. "You would have protected these men forever. You would have died with them, and nothing would change. I wanted to force evolution." "By planting a traitor into my wife's arms?" Marco's voice was low, not cruel but carved. "By trying to burn the only fragile thing I have left?" Saverio's smirk failed him. She was a vulnerability. Easy bait. "Easy until you made it lethal," Marco said. He moved then, not with the measured vastness of a businessman, but with the sudden ferocity of a man who had learned to swallow fear and spit fire. "Confess, who else is on your payroll? How deep did you dig, Saverio?" Saverio's eyes hardened. He began to speak, but the information felt thin against the weight of what Marco had to do. The room filled with the sound of men arriving, loyalists with faces like stones, men who had lost count of favors owed and debts unpaid. Marco listened, not trusting the words alone. He sent half the men away with precise orders. Watch the prosecutor, secure the courier routes, make the city's whispers a closed book. He kept a small circle. He kept the rest for the knife work he now planned. When he left, Saverio's smile had become a shadow. He had miscalculated the cost of crossing a Don who had nothing left to lose but the ghost of containing tenderness. Marco moved through the house like a man mapping the final geometry of a plan. He called Elena with the single thing that could cut through a war of whispers: a plea. "Meet me at the gallery," he said. "Now." She arrived with the photograph pressed into her palm. The galleries closed at night had always felt like sanctums, rooms that held other people's grief safely framed and labeled. Tonight, the canvases watched them like witnesses. Marco stepped into the light like a man shedding armor for skin. There was an odd tenderness in how he held himself, careful, honest, in a way he had seldom been. "I'm going to take a risk," he said, without preamble. "Saverio has been setting fires under my house. He leaked you to the prosecutor, to whoever would listen, to put me on the defensive. He wants my seat." Elena's fingers tightened around the photograph. Fear laced her voice. "What will you do?" "Expose him," Marco said, "publicly. I will dismantle what he built by showing the city his thirst for power. I will make him a lesson. But I will also do something more dangerous. I will remove any reason for him to want my name. I will offer the family a way out, full amnesty for those who accept leniency and go into legitimate business. I will cut ties with the old blood that makes us predators and force our men into contracts that cannot be bought with bullets." She stared at him. It was audacious. It was suicidal in the eyes of many. "You're talking about dissolving the things that made you survive." "Maybe survival isn't worth the cost if it means passing on the cost to a child," he said. "I asked you to bear me an heir out of fear, not courage. I don't want a name so the same machinery repeats. I want a line that will not inherit death." His words landed like an offering. Elena felt the tremor of something like hope. It was naive and necessary. But the plan had a blade. It required a public act that would make Saverio strike faster, harder. To cut him down, Marco had to bait him into showing his hand. That would put them both into the open. "You're going to make yourself a target," Elena said. "You know what that means." "I know," Marco answered. "And I know the one thing you fear more than any headline." She swallowed. "My family being used as an argument to hurt people, to make children pay for the sins of names." "Then stay close," he whispered. "Not behind walls, with me. Not as a possession, Elena, but as the heart I have let rot too long. Help me burn the parts of us that cannot be saved." She wanted to say no. She wanted to protect the gallery like a child clutched at her chest. But the gallery had already been stained. The city had shown its teeth. She thought of the courier who had died and her brother's photograph. Then she thought of children who would not have to grow with names that invited bullets. Her hands finally opened. "Yes," she said, "I'll stand with you. But if you ask me to hide, I will not. If you ask me to be invisible, I will leave." He took her hand then, not in command, but like supplication. The touch was small and enormous. They rehearsed the public lie they would tell, a reorganization for peace, a vow to legitimate ventures. They rehearsed the private truth. The names she had given would be used as leverage to transition men out of the life, not as lists for retaliation. Marco promised to hand over dossiers to the prosecutor only in controlled ways, to create legal corridors for amnesty. Elena promised to be his voice to the prosecutor, to ensure charges would fall on those who had blood on their hands and not on men who could be saved. The first action came within 48 hours. At a press conference staged like a surrender and a salvation, Marco announced a sweeping change. A new charter that allowed men in his orbit to lay down arms, to accept contracts and oversight, to enter businesses in exchange for immunity. Saverio, blinded by pride, could not contain himself. He rose publicly to denounce the Dawn as weak and poisonous. an accusation he had carefully cultivated in private, but which he now cast in public as a virtue. He spoke with the arrogance of a man certain of the crowd's hunger. In the crowd were other men who had been watching, deciding which future to bet on. Savario's words were a match. Marco answered with a single, lethal counter: evidence. The Don's lieutenants, men whose loyalty had been bought and proved in blood, produced logs, recorded conversations, wire transfers that placed Savario at the center of several illicit payoffs. Marco handed the prosecutor a sealed box at the podium, the siren of cameras biting at his heels. He did not hide his face. He did not flinch when Savario lunged at him afterwards, a public performance of rage meant to shame a man whose strength was measured in silence. The courtyard folded into chaos. Bodyguards moved like choreographed predators. Savario's men drew knives, and the city took a breath. In the push and crush, a shot rang out, an ugly punctuation that sent a woman near the stage sprawling. Marco dove toward her instead of Elena. Instinct and years taught him to shield whatever the world aimed at most precious. He buckled under an impact not meant for him. The crowd screamed. Elena heard a noise like a heart breaking. Blood painted the marble steps. Marco lay still, eyes opening to find Elena's face shadowed with horror. He tried to rise. He could not. Around them, men fought to keep the spectacle from spiraling into war. Savario tried to flee. He did not get far. The Don's men, loyal in the way that mattered, trapped him and stripped him of weapons and creed. The prosecutor's aides moved in to place handcuffs, the law swallowing the spectacle like a vulture. The cameras filmed everything. In the stunned quiet that followed, Elena sank to her knees beside Marco, blood sticky on his shirt beneath her fingers. He looked at her as if trying to memorize the shape of her eyes for later, for a future he might not belong to. "You said you'd protect people," she whispered, voice cracking. "You did this to protect you," he corrected, voice thin. "To protect any chance of doing this right. If I die, they'll have to choose. If I live, we can make them choose mercy." Tears cut tracks through the grime on her face. She had not intended this to be the price. Surgeons arrived, urgent hands that smelled of antiseptic and grief. As they worked, Marco squeezed her fingers like a pledge. "Promise me one thing," he murmured, eyes clenching tight against pain. "If I go, don't let my name be a prison for them. Finish what you started. Give them a life." "I promise," Elena choked out, "but you have to stay." He tried to laugh, a small, breathy sound that was both confession and seduction. "Then give me something I wanted that isn't a ledger. Stay. Not because you owe me anything, but because you want to." She cupped his face, wiped blood from his lip with the tenderness of someone who had vowed to keep a photograph whole. "I won't stay because of a contract," she said, the words jagged with fear and something like hope. "I'll stay because I want to see if we can unmake this without making more orphans." Medical hands swallowed them, dragging Elena back gently because she threatened to faint. She watched as Marco was taken into the sterile belly of the hospital and felt the thin thread of the world tug tight around her. Against the hum of machines and the bright lights of the OR, the city outside resumed its motion. Men wheeled into offices, deals whispered in basements, children playing oblivious to the ledger of names. But within a small theater of pain and possibility, two people had chosen a violent path toward change. The surgery was long. While blades cut and nurses monitored, Elena paced hospital floors and folded the spiderwebbed photo into new creases. The prosecutor stood at a distance, useful and shaky, his gratitude tempered by the public theater he could not wholly control. Marco's men kept an oath around the room, a ring of quiet violence that softened at its center with genuine fear. When Marco awoke, the light in his eyes was different, fragile like a window pane just mended. He breathed and found Elena's hand, warm and honest. The world had not been neatly fixed. People had been jailed, alliances had snapped, and Saverio sat behind bars with a face that had finally learned humility. But there were children who would not be pulled into lists. Men who had chosen businesses over bullets because the Don had asked them to. A prosecutor with a file fat with convictions that might steer sentences toward rehabilitation. Marco's scarred hand closed around Elena's, like a claim that had nothing to do with ownership. "You gave me a bargain I didn't think I wanted," he said weakly. "You made me want to be more than a name." She laughed then, a broken sound that held the promise of rain. "You gave me a chance I didn't trust you with," she answered. "Let's make sure we don't squander it." He kissed her hand, tender, reverent, and for the first time, the house, the family, and the city felt like things they could jointly rearrange rather than inherit. The sacrifice had been literal. Marcos's body bled so a new order could be argued into being. It had also been symbolic. A Don willing to be seen in pain in public. A man unafraid to be vulnerable in front of those he commanded. That was a risk no ledger could calculate. Outside, the city murmured about the Don's wound and the gallery curator who had stood by him. Inside the hospital room, two wounded people negotiated the shape of a future, one built on compromise, the other on uncompromising mercy. They would not be naive, they would not be innocent. But they would try, together, to make a legacy where a child's name might mean anything but a target. They relearned the ordinary as if it were an art form, waking in the same bed and not flinching at doors opening, sitting across a kitchen table without a ledger between them, letting small kindnesses accumulate until they outweighed the weight of past bargains. Recovery was practical. Rehab appointments, late-night strategy meetings about which men could be trusted, which ventures could be nudged from black to gray to legal. But it was also domestic in the stubborn way ordinary life is. Soup bowls heated on a stove, a thrown-back laugh at something simple on the radio, handwriting on sticky notes left on the gallery door so the staff would know they were safe. Marco moved more slowly, his body reminding him that each wound had a history. Elena watched him as if learning a map that had new terrain, tenderness worn like a scar rather than the armor he had once used. When he grew impatient in meetings, she held his gaze and folded him back into reason. When she felt panic rise at a shadow on the street, he learned to place himself where her fear could land without breaking her. They were not always graceful. There were nights when old habits, surveillance, bargaining, the reflex to silence, slid back into place and had to be named aloud and burned away with honesty. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes they loved each other badly and then better. The city, cruel and forgiving in equal measures, began to change around them. Men who had once traded lives for loyalty opened bakeries and import businesses. A few went to prison, their children sent to schools paid for by tentative trust funds Marco authorized. The prosecutor kept his end of the fragile bargain, channeling evidence toward reformative sentences. The gallery hosted an exhibit about names and inheritance, Elena's idea, a show full of portraits of anonymous faces, children smiling without surname captions. People in the neighborhood whispered that the Don had been softened. Others said power had merely shifted its shape. Both were true. They tried for a child eventually, not as a ledger entry to be stamped into history, but as a decision made together over nights when the house felt like a future rather than a battlefield. Elena's pregnancy was a different kind of contract. Whispered promises in the dark, the slow learning of small mercies. Marco stopped meetings at sunset and learned lullabies from a nurse who had once rocked his niece in an orphanage. Elena taught him how to choose names that would not include a warning. When the baby arrived, Quiet, fierce, a small body that made promises without asking for anyone's permission. The house breathed differently. Men who had once knelt at altars of power came to hold a life that was deliberately ordinary. A child with a laugh that belonged to no ledger, cheeks that flushed with the ordinary hurt and joy of infancy. The child was neither a political shield nor a legacy paid in fear. The child was an argument made manifest that things could be altered if enough people lived with the courage to change. On slow evenings, when the gallery dimmed and the city exhaled, Marco and Elena would walk the narrow rooftop behind their house. They learned to watch the skyline without counting threats, to count instead the small lights in apartments where ordinary people built their days. Elena would press the photograph, now repaired and framed, into Marco's palm sometimes, and they would study the spider-webbed line together. How something could be shattered and still be whole in a new way. They had not made the world innocent. Names still carried weight. Deals still required negotiation. But in a house that had once been full of ledgers and threats, a child's breath reoriented the math. Marco's hands, scarred, imperfect, learned the language of cradle and gentleness. Elena, who had kept grief like a lit fuse, let herself believe in mornings that were not a prelude to alarms. The last image the city would keep was small and quiet, the dawn and the curator on a balcony at dusk, the baby asleep against Elena's chest, Marco's arm around both of them like a promise finally learned rather than bought. The skyline blinked, neon, church steeples, the river moving as if it had always intended to forgive. And for the first time in their lives, the name Silvestri felt less like a sentence and more like a possibility.